Today's story takes us back to the American frontier in 1834, to a time when survival meant everything and comfort meant nothing. This is the tale of one man's determination to build shelter before winter's deadly embrace could claim his life. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's journey back to a time when every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Drop a comment below and let me know your location and local time. I always find it fascinating to see our global community coming together from all around the world to share these stories. Are you watching during your morning coffee, on a lunch break, or maybe settling in for the evening? I read every single comment and love connecting with all of you. Now let's the story begin. The year was 1834, and Jeremiah Winters had seen enough death in the mountains to know when it was stalking him with the patience of a predator that understood its prey had nowhere to run. The grizzled trapper stood at the edge of a small clearing in what would someday be called Montana Territory, though at this moment it was simply wilderness as vast and unnamed as the day of creation, his weathered hands gripping an axe that had saved his life more times than he could count. Dark clouds gathered on the distant peaks like harbingers of doom, rolling in from the northwest with the ominous weight of a winter storm that promised to test every survival skill he'd learned in 3 hard years of mountain living. "Well, old boy," he muttered to himself, a habit he'd developed after months of solitude that stretched the mind like a bowstring until it either snapped or grew stronger. "It's build or die time, and I ain't ready to meet my maker just yet. Not when there's still so much country to see and so many lessons left to learn." The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, like a green ocean frozen in time, a vast expanse of towering pines and jagged peaks that had claimed the lives of countless men who dared to challenge its authority without the proper respect or preparation. Between 1800 and 1850, roughly 20,000 mountain men had ventured into this uncharted American frontier, armed with nothing but an axe sharp enough to cut bone, a rifle that could drop a grizzly bear at 50 yards, and raw determination that burned like forge fire in their bellies. Most never made it home to tell their tales to grandchildren gathered around warm hearths in civilized parlors. Those who survived had learned to read the land like scripture, understanding that nature offered both salvation and death with equal indifference, dispensing both with the casual cruelty of an indifferent God who cared nothing for human ambition or the dreams of manifest destiny. These were men who had left behind the safety and constraints of civilized society to pursue a life that most would consider madness, trapping beaver in streams so remote they appeared on no maps, living through winters that could freeze a man solid in his sleep, facing down grizzly bears and hostile warriors with nothing but their wits and whatever weapons they could carry. They were the advance guard of American expansion, the scouts and pathfinders who would open routes that wagon trains would later follow, who would establish the first tentative footholds of civilization in a wilderness that had known only the footsteps of indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The fur trade that had drawn them west was itself a product of European fashion and economic forces that these frontiersmen barely understood. Beaver felt was prized for making the finest hats worn by gentlemen in London and New York, and a single prime pelt could bring enough money to support a man for months if he was careful with his spending. But the trade required men willing to venture far from civilization, to live alone or in small groups through seasons of bitter cold and constant danger, to develop skills that would have seemed like magic to their contemporaries back east. Jeremiah had been tracking beaver along the high country for 3 years now, living a life that would seem impossible to civilized folks back in St. Louis, with their soft beds and regular meals, their heated homes and social gatherings. He'd spent entire winters alone in these mountains, sustained by nothing but jerky tough as leather, his wits sharpened to a razor's edge by constant vigilance and an unbreakable will to see another spring that had been forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. But this storm brewing overhead was different from the usual mountain weather that he'd learned to read like a familiar book. This was the kind of tempest that separated the living from the dead, the prepared from the foolish, the genuine mountain men from the pilgrims who'd wandered too far from home. The economic forces that had created the fur trade were already beginning to shift in ways that would soon make obsolete the very lifestyle that Jeremiah and his fellow trappers had embraced. Fashion was changing in the salons of Europe and the drawing rooms of eastern cities, where silk hats were beginning to replace beaver felt as the mark of refinement and status. The Hudson's Bay Company and American Fur Company were reporting declining profits and reduced demand, though the news travelled slowly to men scattered across thousands of square miles of wilderness. The era of the mountain man was approaching its end, though few of those living it understood that they were participating in the closing chapter of a brief but significant period in American history. But in the immediate present, such larger historical trends mattered less than the gathering storm clouds and the urgent necessity of building shelter before winter arrived in earnest. Jeremiah had spent the last 3 days scouting this particular spot with the methodical care of a man whose life depended on making the right choice, and it was perfect in ways that only years of wilderness experience could fully appreciate. The clearing sat on a gentle south-facing slope that would catch every precious ray of winter sun, with a natural windbreak of dense pines to the north that would deflect the worst of the Arctic blast that could drive the temperature to levels that froze human flesh in minutes. A spring bubbled nearby, its water clear and cold as liquid crystal, fed by underground sources that wouldn't freeze even in the depths of winter, when the temperature dropped low enough to turn a man's breath to ice crystals that fell to the ground with the sound of breaking glass. He'd spent the last 3 days scouting this particular spot with the methodical care of a man whose life depended on making the right choice, and it was perfect in ways that only years of wilderness experience could fully appreciate. The clearing sat on a gentle south-facing slope that would catch every precious ray of winter sun, with a natural windbreak of dense pines to the north that would deflect the worst of the Arctic blasts. A spring bubbled nearby, its water clear and cold as liquid crystal, the kind that wouldn't freeze even in the depths of winter when the temperature dropped low enough to turn a man's breath to ice crystals. From this elevation, he could spot trouble coming from miles away, whether it be Blackfoot warriors on the warpath, claim jumpers looking for easy pickings, or the occasional grizzly bear awakening from hibernation with a belly full of hunger and a disposition to match. Location, 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 Jerem chuckled grimly, remembering something an old-timer named Samuel Bridger had told him years ago in a smoke-filled trading post down on the Green River. Pick your spot like you're picking a wife, boy. It's got to keep you warm when the cold comes calling, safe when trouble's riding the wind, and alive through the worst times when death comes knocking at your door like an unwelcome neighbour. The trapper's journal, which he kept wrapped in oiled cloth in his possibles bag like a sacred text, contained detailed observations about cabin construction that would later be studied by historians trying to understand how men survived in conditions that would kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. But right now it was simply a record of survival techniques learned through bitter experience, each entry written by firelight in a hand that grew steadier with each passing month of mountain living. He'd written just yesterday, his pencil stub scratching across the rough paper. Storm coming hard and fast. Got maybe 12 hours to get walls up before winter shows her teeth and reminds me why she's killed better men than me. God help me if I'm wrong about the timing, because there won't be a second chance. As dawn broke fully over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and rose that would make a city artist weep with envy, Jeremiah shouldered his axe with the practiced motion of a man who'd made the tool an extension of his own body, and approached the first of several lodgepole pines he'd marked for cutting. These trees, with their straight grain and natural resistance to rot, were the backbone of frontier construction, seasoned by mountain winds and winter storms into timber that could last for generations. He'd learned from native tribes whose ancestors had lived in these mountains for countless generations, and from fellow trappers who'd paid for their knowledge with frostbitten fingers and scarred hands, that selecting the right timber was just as important as knowing how to cut it properly. "Right, sweetheart," he said to the towering pine that rose nearly 100 feet into the crystal-clear morning air. "Nothing personal in this, but I need you more than you need this particular spot of ground." The first swing of his axe sent a satisfying vibration up his arms, the shock travelling through muscle and bone like a tuning fork struck against stone. The blade, forged in St. Louis by a blacksmith who understood that a mountain man's life might depend on the quality of his steel, and sharp enough to cut bone without chipping, bit deep into the bark with the solid thunk that meant good wood and clean cutting. Chips of yellow pine flew as he worked with the rhythm he'd developed over 3 years of constant practice, creating a precise notch on the side facing the direction he wanted the tree to fall. Each swing was deliberate, calculated with the care of a man who understood that out here, a mistake could mean death, and there was no one around for 1,000 miles to pull a fallen tree off a crushed body, or to say words over a shallow grave. The work was brutal in ways that city folks could never comprehend. By the time he'd felled 7 trees, working through the morning with the desperate efficiency of a man racing against time itself, his hands were raw and bleeding despite the thick calluses built up from years of this life. Blood seeped through his buckskin gloves like red ink through parchment, making the axe handle slick and treacherous to grip. But he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Not when winter was breathing down his neck like a hungry wolf. The alternative was a shallow grave come spring, another nameless casualty of the frontier whose bones would be scattered by wolves and whose story would never be told. "My hands bled so bad from the axe that my log notches filled with blood," he would later write in his journal, the words scratched out by firelight while his wounded hands throbbed with every heartbeat. By nightfall, I couldn't feel my fingers, couldn't tell if I was gripping the handle or just hoping it would stay put. But I kept swinging like a man possessed, because I knew the alternative was a shallow grave come spring, and I ain't ready to fertilize this mountain dirt just yet. As he worked with the single-minded focus of a man whose life depended on every stroke of his axe, Jeremiah's mind wandered to the comfortable trading posts down on the Missouri River, with their roaring fires that never needed tending, and barrels of whiskey that could warm a man's belly and blur the edges of loneliness. He thought about St. Louis with its bustling streets full of people who'd never known the kind of silence that could drive a man mad, and women in calico dresses who smelled of soap and civilized things instead of wood smoke and buckskin. It all seemed like a dream now, or maybe a story someone had told him once around a campfire when the night was long and the whiskey was flowing. The wilderness had a way of making civilization feel like a myth, something that might have existed once but seemed too soft and unreal to be part of the same world, where men built shelters with their bare hands or died trying. When disaster struck, it came without warning, the way most calamities did in the mountains, where a man's luck could change faster than the weather. Halfway through felling his 8th tree, working with the mechanical precision that came from desperate necessity, the axe head suddenly flew off the handle with a metallic ring, loosened by thousands of impacts against unforgiving wood. It landed several feet away in the underbrush with a dull thud that sounded to Jeremiah's ears like the death knell of all his hopes for survival. "Well, hell and damnation," Jeremiah cursed with the creative profanity of a man who'd learned that sometimes colourful language was the only way to express the magnitude of frontier frustration. His heart raced like a rabbit's as he searched frantically through the undergrowth, pushing aside pine needles and fallen branches with the desperation of a man who understood that losing an axe out here was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. There were no hardware stores in this wilderness, no neighbours to borrow from, no solutions except what a man could create with his own 2 hands, and whatever materials the forest provided. Just the endless wilderness and whatever tools a man could carry on his back, and the cold certainty that winter would not wait for him to solve his problems. Relief flooded through him like warm whiskey when he finally spotted the metal head gleaming dully among the fallen leaves, catching the light like a promise of survival snatched back from the jaws of death. The repair took precious time he couldn't afford, each minute stolen from the shrinking window of opportunity that stood between him and a frozen death. From his possibles bag, that leather repository of everything a mountain man needed to stay alive, he pulled out a carefully saved roll of rawhide that he'd been hoarding for just such an emergency. The rawhide represented hours of patient work, skinning and curing and cutting, but it was insurance against exactly this kind of disaster. He soaked it in precious water to make it pliable, his fingers working with the practiced skill of a man who'd learned that improvisation was often the difference between life and death, then carefully reshaped the top of the handle where it fitted into the axe head. The wet rawhide wrapped tightly around the joint would shrink as it dried, creating a bond nearly as strong as iron, and certainly strong enough to last until he could make more permanent repairs. These men weren't just survivors. A historical reenactor would later observe with the wisdom of hindsight and modern comfort. They were problem solvers of the highest order, engineers and architects and doctors all rolled into one. They had to be innovators and craftsmen, hunters and weathermen, diplomats and warriors, all with maybe 10 tools total, and the certain knowledge that help wasn't coming. By the time darkness fell like a curtain across the mountains, Jeremiah had 7 logs ready for construction, each one carefully selected and prepared with the attention to detail that meant the difference between a shelter that would last the winter and a pile of timber that would collapse under the first heavy snow. His body screamed for rest, every muscle pushed beyond its normal limits and into the realm where pain became a constant companion. He'd forced himself to eat sparingly throughout the day, chewing tough jerky that required patience to soften while he worked, knowing that when his meagre supplies ran out in a few days, he'd need to hunt for fresh meat. But hunting meant time away from building, and time was the one luxury he couldn't afford when winter was breathing down his neck like a hungry predator. The night was brutal in ways that tested every lesson he'd learned about wilderness survival. He slept fitfully beside his fire, wrapped in a wool blanket that grew stiff with frost despite his careful tending of the flames, lying on a bed of pine boughs that provided minimal cushioning between his aching body and the frozen earth. The ground beneath him was hard as stone, nothing like the soft mattress he'd known in his youth when comfort was something taken for granted rather than earned through blood and sweat. Every sound made him alert, the scream of a mountain lion echoing through the darkness, the howl of wolves pack hunting in the distance, or worse, the soft footfall of an approaching grizzly bear drawn by the scent of man and the promise of an easy meal. When he woke before dawn to a world transformed by snow, Jeremiah felt the cold settling into his bones like an old enemy come to call. Not a gentle dusting of white that might melt by noon, but a solid 3 inches that had fallen silently while he slept, blanketing everything in a deceptive beauty that masked the deadly seriousness of his situation. His breath formed clouds in the bitter air that dispersed slowly in the still morning, and his hands were so stiff from the cold that he could barely move them without pain shooting up his arms. The blisters from yesterday's work had become frozen scabs that cracked and bled as he flexed his fingers, sending drops of red onto the pristine snow like scattered garnets. "Storm's coming faster than I thought," he muttered through lips that were already chapped and bleeding from the dry cold, stirring the embers of his fire back to life with the careful attention of a man who understood that flame was the difference between warmth and death. "Better get moving or I'll be wolf food by week's end, and that ain't how I plan to end my story." The day that followed would test every skill he'd learned in 3 years of mountain living, pushing him to the very limits of human endurance and beyond. He began by debarking the logs he'd felled, stripping away the moisture-holding bark that would attract insects and promote rot if left in place. The work was tedious but absolutely necessary, each log requiring careful attention to ensure that the wood beneath was clean and ready for construction. Each stroke of his knife had to be precise, removing the bark without gouging the wood underneath, a process that seemed simple but required the kind of skill that only came from long practice. It was mid-morning when he heard the sound that made his blood freeze in his veins, the unmistakable crunch of snow under a moccasin, the rhythmic footfall that meant human presence in a place where humans were more likely to be enemies than friends. Someone was approaching his camp with the stealth of a hunter, and in this wilderness visitors were rarely friendly to lone trappers working rich territory. It could be Blackfoot warriors who'd killed more than a few white men in these mountains and decorated their lodges with pale scalps. Could be claim jumpers looking to steal what little he had, men made desperate by failed ventures and empty bellies. Could even be deserters from some military expedition, dangerous in the way that desperate men always were when they had nothing left to lose. Jeremiah's hand slid to his rifle with the smooth motion of long practice, fingers wrapping around the cold metal of the barrel while his thumb found the hammer. He lay perfectly still among the pine boughs, listening with ears that had been trained by years of wilderness living to distinguish between natural sounds and those that meant danger. Then a voice called out through this morning air, rough but distinctly human and speaking English with an accent he recognized. "Hello, the camp coming in friendly. Don't shoot, friend, we're white men and peaceable." "Show yourself then," Jeremiah called back, sitting up slowly and deliberately, rifle ready but not directly aimed at the voices. Trust came hard in the mountains, where a man's life often depended on his ability to judge character in the space of a heartbeat, but sometimes survival required taking calculated risks. 2 figures emerged from the tree line like ghosts materializing from morning mist, their breath clouding in the cold air as they approached with the careful gait of men who understood that sudden movements could be fatal. Men in buckskins worn soft and stained with the patina of hard use, each with a rifle cradled in his arms and an axe hanging from his belt. Trappers by the look of them, with the lean, weathered appearance of those who'd survived multiple winters in country that killed the unprepared. One was tall and lanky with a greying beard that reached his chest like a waterfall of silver, the other shorter and stockier, with a face so weathered by sun and wind that it looked carved from the mountains themselves. "Name's Fitzgerald," said the tall one, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. "This here's Cooper. Spotted your smoke yesterday evening when we was making camp down by Beaver Creek. Thought we'd check if you was alive or dead, seeing as how most folks don't winter this high up without good reason or bad judgment." Jeremiah studied them carefully with eyes that had learned to read men like weather signs, looking for the telltale markers of desperation or hostile intent. Their gear was worn but well maintained, showing the careful attention to equipment that marked experienced mountain men. No signs of the wild desperation that might make them dangerous, no nervous twitching or excessive interest in his possessions. And truth be told, he could use the help more than his pride wanted to admit. Building a cabin alone was a race against time that he wasn't certain he could win. "Coffee's ready if you want some," he said, nodding toward his small fire where a battered tin pot steamed with the bitter brew that passed for luxury in the wilderness. It was as close to a welcome as he was going to give until he'd taken their measure more completely. In his later writings, preserved in a historical society archive that would fascinate scholars for generations, a mountain man would describe such encounters. "Met two fellows building a cabin near the Yellowstone. We helped raise their walls in exchange for coffee and conversation. Neither of us mentioned how we nearly shot each other at first light. Some things don't need saying out here, where trust is earned drop by drop and a man's reputation travels faster than he does." Fitzgerald and Cooper hunkered down by the fire like old friends, accepting the tin cups of bitter coffee Jeremiah offered, with the grateful silence of men who understood that hot liquid was luxury beyond measure in this frozen wilderness. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, boiled and reboiled from grounds that had seen better days, but it was hot, and out here in the high country where winter came early and stayed late, that counted for more than flavour or refinement. Both men had the hard, lean look of those who'd survived multiple winters in the high country, their faces bearing the weathered patina of wind and sun that marked them as clearly as any brand. Their buckskins were patched and stained with the honest dirt of hard living, their faces windburned and etched with lines that spoke of squinting into too many blizzards and scanning too many horizons for signs of trouble. But their eyes were clear and alert, the eyes of men who'd learned to see danger before it saw them, who could read sign-like scripture and track trouble through a blizzard. "That's a good start you got there," Fitzgerald said, nodding toward the half-built cabin foundation, with the practiced eye of a man who'd raised more than a few structures in his day. "But them walls need to be higher before that storm hits proper. I can smell snow coming in the air, taste it on the wind like a promise that winter don't intend to break." Cooper grunted in agreement, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow with the accuracy of long practice. "Reckon we can get it done today if we all pitch in. 3 men working together can accomplish what would take 1 man 3 days on his own, and time's something we ain't got much of if that sky means what I think it means." Trust came hard in the mountains where a man's life often depended on his ability to judge character in the space of a heartbeat. But survival trumped suspicion when winter was breathing down your neck like a hungry wolf. 3 men could accomplish in a day what would take 1 man 3 days working alone, and Jeremiah's pride wasn't worth freezing to death for the sake of stubborn independence. Besides, there was something about these two that spoke of experience and competence, the kind of steady reliability that marked successful mountain men. "Got tools for all of us?" Jeremiah asked, studying their equipment with the critical eye of a man whose life might depend on the quality of their gear. Cooper patted the axe hanging from his belt with obvious affection. "Never go anywhere without old Betsy here. She's cut more timber than a sawmill and split more skulls than a battlefield. Bought her from a blacksmith in St. Louis, who guaranteed she'd never let me down, and she ain't disappointed me yet." Fitzgerald stretched his lanky frame and stood with the fluid motion of a much younger man. "Let's get to it then. Daylight's burning, and that storm ain't going to wait for us to finish our coffee and conversation. I've seen too many good men freeze to death because they spent too much time talking and not enough time working." What followed was a masterclass in frontier cooperation that would have impressed engineers and architects who thought they understood construction. Fitzgerald, it turned out, had built more than a few cabins in his day, and he'd learned techniques that transformed the crude art of wilderness building into something approaching science. He showed Jeremiah a better method for notching logs, what he called the saddle notch, a technique that required more skill but produced infinitely stronger joints. "See, you don't want to cut straight across like you've been doing," he explained, demonstrating with his axe in smooth, practiced strokes that sent chips flying with mechanical precision. "You want to round it like this, curved like a saddle, so the log above sits snug as a bug in a rug. Keeps the wind out better, makes the whole structure stronger, and prevents the logs from shifting when the timber starts to settle." His technique created a curved depression at the end of each log, perfectly shaped to cradle the crossing log with mathematical precision. It was simple in concept but difficult in execution, the kind of knowledge that could only come from years of hard experience and the kind of education that was written in calluses and scars rather than books and papers. Each cut had to be perfect, because there was no room for error when your life depended on the integrity of every joint. Cooper, meanwhile, proved to be a master at positioning logs with the kind of skill that made back-breaking work look effortless. Despite his stocky build, he could maneuver heavy timber with surprising grace, using leverage and technique rather than brute force to accomplish what seemed impossible for one man alone. "It's all about the fulcrum," he explained as they rolled a massive log up a makeshift ramp constructed from smaller timbers, his movements economical and efficient. "Let the mountain do the work for you. Physics don't care how strong you are, just how smart you work. I seen big, strong men kill themselves trying to muscle logs into place, while smaller fellows who understood leverage could build twice as fast with half the effort. With the addition of two experienced men who knew their craft like master artisans, the work took on a new rhythm that was almost musical in its efficiency. By midday, they had the 4 base logs positioned with mathematical precision and the second course in place, each log fitted to its neighbour with the kind of craftsmanship that would last for generations. The foundation of the cabin was solid as bedrock, a simple rectangle that would soon become Jeremiah's sanctuary against the coming winter and everything it would throw at him. "Building a cabin alone is a dance with death," Cooper observed, as they paused for a meal of jerky and water that tasted like ambrosia after hours of back-breaking labour. "One slip and 2,000 pounds of pine will snap your spine like a twig, crush you flat as a pancake. I saw a man near Fort Hall get caught when his log rolled back on him. We buried what was left of him in a shallow grave and divided his possessions according to mountain law. That's frontier justice, quick, final, and fair as we can make it." The afternoon brought new challenges as the walls rose higher and the work became more complex. Raising logs alone had been back-breaking work that pushed the limits of human endurance, But with 3 men working in harmony, they could accomplish what seemed impossible for individuals. They created a system using ropes and leverage, rolling logs up improvised ramps and positioning them with the precision that would have impressed master carpenters who'd served formal apprenticeships and learned their trade in comfortable workshops. Most folks don't realize, Fitzgerald said as they positioned another log with the careful attention to detail that marked true craftsmen, that these cabins were engineered as well as any city building, maybe better, had to be. Your life depended on every joint being tight, every log being true, every corner being square. City buildings fall down and somebody complains to the mayor. Wilderness cabins fail, and somebody dies alone in the cold. As the walls rose higher with each carefully placed log, the 3 men settled into an easy camaraderie born of shared purpose and mutual respect. They worked with the efficiency of those who understood that time was their enemy and winter was coming fast, each man contributing his specialized knowledge to create something greater than any of them could have built alone. The conversation flowed as easily as the work, men sharing stories and experiences that helped pass the time, while their hands stayed busy with the endless details of construction. You ever wonder what it would be like, Cooper mused during a brief rest, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air, to live in one of them big cities back east, all them people crammed together like ants in a hill, never seeing the sky except through windows, never hearing anything but the noise of other folks. Tried it once, Fitzgerald replied, taking a long drink from his water jug and savouring the cold liquid like fine wine. Lasted about a week before I started feeling like a caged animal. Too much noise, too many rules, too many people telling you what to do and when to do it. Give me the mountains any day, where a man can breathe free air and make his own decisions without asking permission from folks who never set foot outside a parlour. Jeremiah nodded in agreement, understanding exactly what his temporary partners meant. Man's got to be free to live his own life according to his own lights. Out here, your word is your bond and your rifle is your law. No judges, no lawyers, no politicians making rules for folks they'll never meet. Just you and the mountain and whatever you can make of the situation with your own 2 hands. By late afternoon, the walls were shoulder high and growing steadily with each log they wrestled into place. The storm clouds had darkened ominously overhead, building into towering thunderheads that promised snow and wind and all the fury that mountain weather could unleash. Occasional snowflakes drifted down like advance scouts from the army of winter, settling on their shoulders and melting from the heat of their exertion. But the men pressed on with the grim determination of those who understood they were racing against time itself, driven by the knowledge that they were building more than just a shelter. They were constructing the difference between life and death. Going to need a roof soon, Fitzgerald observed, eyeing the darkening sky with the concern of a man who'd seen what mountain storms could do to the unprepared. Snow hits them walls without something to shed it, and you'll be digging yourself out come morning, assuming the weight don't crush the whole structure flat. I've seen good walls collapse under snow that piled up faster than a man could shovel it away. They had enough logs now for the walls, cut and shaped and ready for placement, but the roof would require different techniques and materials that would test their ingenuity and skill. Jeremiah had seen enough cabins to know the basics. Long poles running from wall to wall like the ribs of some great beast, covered with smaller branches laid like shingles, then bark stripped from the fallen trees, and finally sod if they could find earth that wasn't frozen solid. Sod roof's the way to go if you can manage it, Cooper said, his breath visible in the increasingly cold air. Keeps the heat in during winter, keeps the rain out during spring, and gives you insulation that'll last for years. Seen men freeze to death under nothing but pine boughs and wishful thinking. Good roof's worth its weight in gold when their mercury drops and the wind starts howling like banshees. As darkness began to fall earlier than usual under the heavy cloud cover, they had the walls nearly complete. A solid rectangle of interlocked logs that would soon be Jeremiah's home through the long mountain winter. The work had been brutal, pushing all three men to their physical limits, but the addition of two experienced hands had made the impossible merely difficult. What would have taken Jeremiah a week working alone had been accomplished in a single day through cooperation and shared expertise. "We'll finish the roof tomorrow," Fitzgerald said as they gathered around the fire for their evening meal, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames that cast wild shadows on the surrounding trees. "Storm won't hit full force until tomorrow night, I'd say, judging by the way the wind's shifting and the colour of them clouds. We've got time, but not much to spare." "How can you tell?" Jeremiah asked, genuinely curious about the kind of weather wisdom that could mean the difference between preparedness and catastrophe. "Been reading mountain weather for 20 years, Fitzgerald replied, stirring the fire with a stick and watching the sparks spiral up into the darkness. The way the wind shifts from southwest to northwest, how the snow falls light then heavy then light again, the way the animals act when they sense a big storm coming. Birds flying lower than usual, deer heading for heavy timber, even the way your coffee tastes different when the barometric pressure drops. Tomorrow night, maybe the day after, we'll see the real thing, the kind of storm that reshapes the landscape and tests everything you think you know about survival." They shared their meagre supplies around the fire that night. Jerky tough as leather that required patient chewing, hardtack that could break a tooth if you weren't careful, and coffee that had been boiled and reboiled until it was more tannin than bean, but it was hot and contained enough caffeine to keep a man alert during the long watches of the night. But it was warm food shared among comrades, and out here in the wilderness where death was always just one mistake away, that counted for luxury beyond measure. The conversation flowed as easily as the bitter coffee, three men sharing stories and experiences that helped forge the bonds of temporary partnership. "You know what I miss most about civilization?" Cooper asked as they huddled around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their weathered faces, while the wind moaned through the pines like the voices of all the men who died in these mountains. "Women," Fitzgerald replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the longing of a man who'd been too long without the company of the gentler sex, earning knowing chuckles from the other two men who understood exactly what he meant. "Well, that too," Cooper admitted with a grin that transformed his weathered features. "But I was thinking about bread. Real bread, baked in an oven by someone who knew what they were doing, still warm from the fire with butter melting into the crust. Bread that don't require soaking in coffee just to make it soft enough to chew without breaking your teeth. And butter," Jeremiah added, his mouth watering at the memory of simple pleasures that seemed impossibly distant in this harsh landscape. "My ma used to make the finest butter in Missouri, yellow as gold and sweet as honey. She'd churn it fresh every week, and the smell would fill the whole house with something that meant home and safety, and all the things a man takes for granted until he's living on jerky and hope." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each man lost in his own memories of a softer life, but none of them spoke of going back. The mountains had claimed them, changed them into something different from the men they'd once been. "I keep a journal," Jeremiah said eventually, "writing down everything I learn out here. Figured maybe someday it might help somebody else." "Good idea," Fitzgerald nodded. "Knowledge is the only thing that keeps you alive in this country. Share it or it dies with you." As the fire burned down to embers, the three men wrapped themselves in their blankets and settled in for the night. Tomorrow would bring the final push to complete the cabin, and then Fitzgerald and Cooper would move on to their own wintering grounds. "Much obliged for the help," Jeremiah said as they prepared for sleep. "Nothing to it," Cooper replied. "What goes around comes around out here. Maybe next year we'll be the ones needing a hand." The night was cold but peaceful. Snow fell steadily, muffling all sound except the occasional crack of a tree settling in the frost. The three men slept the deep sleep of the exhausted, their bodies finally able to rest after a day of grueling labour. Dawn came grey and cold, with snow falling more heavily than before. The storm was definitely building, and they had precious little time to finish the roof. "Today's the day," Fitzgerald announced as they stirred the fire back to life. "We get that roof on, or Jeremiah here's going to have a mighty cold winter." The work began immediately after a quick breakfast of coffee and jerky. They cut long poles from the smaller trees Jeremiah had felled, creating a framework that would span the walls and support the roof covering. "Pitch is important," Cooper explained as they positioned the ridgepole. "Too flat and the snow will pile up and crush it. Too steep and it'll shed the insulation you need." The framework went up quickly with three men working together. Soon they had a solid structure that would support whatever covering they could manage. The next step was more challenging, creating a waterproof barrier that would keep out snow and rain. "Pine bark," Fitzgerald said. "Thick slabs of it, overlapped like shingles. It'll last years if you do it right." They stripped bark from the fallen trees, cutting it into manageable sections and layering it over the pole framework. It was painstaking work, but each piece brought them closer to a weatherproof shelter. "I helped build a cabin like this up on the Yellowstone," Cooper said as they worked. "Trapper named Mackenzie spent the whole winter snug as a bug while the rest of us near froze to death in brush lean-tos. By midday, they had the basic roof structure complete. It wasn't pretty, but it would shed water and support the weight of snow. The final step was adding a layer of sod for insulation, but the frozen ground made that nearly impossible. "Use pine boughs," Fitzgerald suggested. "Thick layer of them, needles down. It'll insulate almost as good as sod, and you can always add more." They spent the afternoon gathering armloads of pine branches, layering them thick over the bark roof. The result was crude but functional, a shelter that would keep a man alive through even the worst mountain winter. As they worked on the finishing touches, the snow began falling more heavily. Fat flakes drifted down steadily and the wind was picking up. "Storm's coming tonight for sure," Cooper observed, scanning the darkening sky. "We best finish up and get ourselves to lower ground." The final task was building a fireplace and chimney. This was perhaps the most critical part of the entire structure. Get it wrong, and you'd either freeze to death or burn down your cabin. "Stone's best," Fitzgerald said, "but mud and sticks will do in a pinch. Main thing is getting the draw right so the smoke goes out instead of staying in." They built a simple hearth against one wall, using flat stones from the creek bed and mortar made from clay and grass. The chimney was more challenging, a framework of sticks and mud that rose through the roof to provide proper ventilation. "Test it before you depend on it," Cooper advised as Jeremiah lit a small fire to check the draw. Nothing worse than a cabin full of smoke when you can't open the door because of a blizzard. The fire caught and burned cleanly, with smoke drawing up through the chimney and out into the grey afternoon. It was a beautiful sight, proof that the cabin would not only shelter him, but warm him through the long winter ahead. As evening approached, Fitzgerald and Cooper began gathering their gear. They had their own preparations to make before the storm hit, and they needed to get back to their own camps while travel was still possible. You're set up good here," Fitzgerald said, shaking Jeremiah's hand. "That cabin will see you through whatever winter throws at you. "Can't thank you boys enough," Jeremiah replied, understanding that words were inadequate to express what these two strangers had done for him. "Couldn't have done it without your help, and that's the plain truth. You saved my life as sure as if you'd pulled me from an avalanche or fought off a grizzly. Just pass it along when you get the chance," Cooper said, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle one final time. "Help the next fellow you come across who needs it. That's how we all survive out here, looking out for each other when it matters most, even if we're strangers who'll probably never meet again." As his temporary partners disappeared into the swirling snow, their figures becoming ghostly silhouettes before vanishing entirely into the white wilderness, Jeremiah stood in the doorway of his completed cabin and marveled at what they'd accomplished together. It was small by the standards of civilized construction, maybe 10 feet by 12, barely larger than a wealthy man's closet, but it was solid as bedrock, weatherproof as any structure built by master craftsmen, and warm in ways that went beyond mere temperature. Most importantly, it was his, built with his own hands and the generous help of two men who'd asked for nothing in return except coffee and conversation. He spent the evening organizing his meager possessions with the methodical care of a man who understood that every item had to serve multiple purposes and earn its place in his limited storage space. His rifle went in the corner where he could reach it quickly if danger came calling. His traps and spare tools found homes on pegs driven into the log walls. His few clothes, spare ammunition, and precious medical supplies went into a wooden box he'd fashioned from split logs. And his journal, that irreplaceable record of hard-won knowledge, found a place of honor on the crude mantel above the fireplace where it would stay dry and safe. The fireplace drew well, pulling smoke up through the chimney with the steady efficiency that meant proper construction and good ventilation. The walls were tight as a drum, with no gaps where wind could penetrate and steal precious warmth. The roof shed snow perfectly, allowing the white accumulation to slide off rather than building up to dangerous levels. He had enough firewood cut and stacked to last several days of heavy burning, and he knew exactly where to find more when the supply ran low. Standing dead trees that would burn hot and clean, fallen timber that had seasoned naturally through summer heat and autumn rains. "Well, old boy," he said to himself as he settled in for his first night in the completed cabin, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space that would be his whole world for the next 6 months. "Looks like you're going to live through another winter after all." Fitzgerald and Cooper made the difference between surviving and dying, and that's a debt I'll never be able to repay properly. Outside, the storm hit with the full fury of mountain winter unleashed, wind howling through the trees like the voices of all the men who died unprepared in these peaks. Snow piled up against the north wall of the cabin with frightening speed, already knee-deep and climbing higher with each passing hour. The temperature plummeted until the very air seemed to crystallize, and even the pine trees groaned under the assault of wind and cold. But inside his snug sanctuary, Jeremiah was warm and dry and safe, protected by walls he'd built with his own hands, and the generous assistance of two fellow travelers who'd appeared when hope was nearly gone. He pulled out his journal and wrote by firelight, the dancing flames casting moving shadows on the rough log walls, while outside the storm raged with biblical fury. Cabin complete and tested by the first real storm of winter. Walls tight, roof solid, fireplace drawing perfectly. Storm raging outside like the very demons of hell, but I'm snug as a bug in here, warm and dry and grateful to be alive. Fitzgerald and Cooper proved that men can still help each other, even in this God-forsaken wilderness, where every man is supposed to look out for himself. Maybe there's hope for humanity after all. even in places where civilization seems like nothing but a distant memory. The wind continued to howl like a living thing in torment, rattling the roof and testing every joint in the cabin's construction. But Jeremiah felt peaceful for the first time in weeks. The kind of deep, bone-deep peace that comes from knowing you've met a challenge and emerged victorious through skill, determination, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. He had shelter that would protect him from the worst weather the mountains could produce. He had warmth from a fireplace that burned steady and true. He had enough supplies to last until he could hunt again and replenish his stores. Most importantly, he had proved to himself once again that a man could survive anything if he kept his wits about him, never gave up hope, and remained open to help when it was offered by those who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. As he drifted off to sleep on his bed of pine boughs, wrapped in his wool blanket with the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth, Jeremiah reflected on the strange brotherhood of the mountains, men who might never learn each other's real names, who came together for a brief time to accomplish something that none of them could have managed alone, then parted ways knowing they might never meet again, but carrying with them the knowledge that human decency and mutual aid still existed, even in the loneliest places on earth. The storm raged for 3 days and nights, dumping nearly 4 feet of snow on the mountains and transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful and deadly. But Jeremiah's cabin stood firm through it all, its walls tight and its roof solid, proving that good craftsmanship and careful construction could withstand whatever nature chose to unleash. When the weather finally cleared and he emerged to find a world buried in pristine white, he felt like a man reborn, tested by adversity and found worthy of survival. "Thank you, boys," he said quietly to the empty forest, thinking of Fitzgerald and Cooper and hoping they had made it safely to their own wintering grounds. "Hope you made it through safe and sound. Maybe our trails will cross again come spring, and I can return the favour you did for me." As he drifted off to sleep on his bed of pine boughs, Jeremiah reflected on the strange life he'd chosen. It was brutal, lonely, and dangerous, but it was also free in a way that civilized men could never understand. Out here, a man was measured by his skills, his word, and his willingness to help a fellow human being when help was needed. The storm raged for 3 days, dumping nearly 4 feet of snow on the mountains. But Jeremiah's cabin stood firm, its walls tight and its roof solid. When the weather finally cleared, he emerged to find a transformed landscape, white and pristine and beautiful beyond description. "Thank you, boys," he said quietly, thinking of Fitzgerald and Cooper. "Hope you made it through safe." In the months that followed, Jeremiah would have many visitors, fellow trappers, native traders, even the occasional army patrol. Each would marvel at the solid construction of his cabin and ask for advice on building their own shelters. And each time, Jeremiah would share what he'd learned, passing along the knowledge that had kept him alive. The cabin would stand for many years, long after Jeremiah had moved on to other hunting grounds. It would shelter dozens of men through harsh mountain winters, a testament to the skills and determination of those who chose to make their lives in the wilderness. And in his journal, which would eventually find its way to a historical society archive, Jeremiah wrote, "A man's not truly alive until he's built something with his own hands that will outlast him. That cabin taught me that we're all stronger than we think, and that even in the loneliest places human kindness still matters." Years later, when the frontier had moved on, and the mountains were filled with mining towns and railroad lines, old-timers would still point to the ruins of cabins like Jeremiah's and tell stories of the men who'd built them. They were more than just shelters. They were symbols of an era when survival depended entirely on what a man could accomplish with his own two hands, and an unbreakable will to live. September brought the first hints of autumn, and with them a sense of urgency about making his decision that he couldn't ignore much longer. The aspens were beginning to turn gold on the high slopes, and morning frost was becoming more frequent. If he was going to leave before winter locked the high country in snow and ice for 6 months, he needed to make his choice soon and act on it decisively. The deciding moment came during a chance encounter with a family of settlers who had become lost while attempting to reach Oregon Territory through an unmapped pass in the mountains. They'd been wandering for days, running dangerously low on supplies and beginning to panic when they stumbled across his cabin like refugees finding sanctuary. The father was injured from a fall, one of the children was sick with fever, and the mother was barely holding the family together through sheer determination and maternal will. Jeremiah spent a week nursing them back to health and guiding them to the main trail, sharing his medical knowledge and survival skills while learning about their dreams and motivations for attempting the dangerous overland journey. As he watched them disappear down the valley, heading toward their new life in Oregon with renewed hope and confidence, he realized that this was what his future looked like, helping people navigate the transition from the settled East to the Wild West, using his hard-won knowledge to make their journeys safer and more successful. "The age of the solitary mountain man is ending," he wrote that night in his journal, the words flowing onto the page with unusual clarity and conviction. "But the age of the frontier guide is just beginning. There will be thousands of families like the Johnsons, people who need someone to show them the way through this wilderness, to teach them how to survive in country that can kill the unprepared. Maybe that's my calling now, to be a bridge between the world I've known and the world that's coming." He spent October putting his affairs in order with the methodical care of a man who understood the importance of proper preparation. He cached supplies and tools that he might need if he ever returned, sealing them in waterproof containers and hiding them in locations only he would remember. He weatherproofed the cabin against the coming winter, banking earth around the foundation, and checking every joint for gaps that might let in wind and snow. And he prepared for the journey back to civilization, a reverse migration that would take him from the heights of self-reliance back to the complexities of social cooperation. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the place itself, the valley that had been his home, his sanctuary, his university, and his proving ground for 4 transformative years. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the creek held significance for him, markers of lessons learned, challenges overcome, moments of terror and triumph that had shaped him into the man he'd become. He'd arrived as a young fellow seeking adventure and freedom from society's constraints. He was leaving as someone who understood both the possibilities and the costs of that freedom, who had learned that true independence required not just individual skill, but also the wisdom to know when cooperation was essential. "I came here to escape civilization," he wrote in his final journal entry from the cabin, the words barely visible in the flickering light of his small fire. "I'm leaving to help bring civilization to others. The irony isn't lost on me, but maybe that's how progress works. Each generation prepares the way for the next, passing along what they've learned so that those who follow don't have to reinvent every solution or repeat every mistake." The journey back to St. Louis took 3 weeks, following trails he'd traveled countless times, but now seeing them with completely different eyes. Instead of looking for beaver sign and game trails, he studied the routes from the perspective of wagon trains and future development, noting where the best river crossings were located, which passes would be most practical for heavily loaded wagons. where settlements would naturally develop around water sources and natural resources. Every mile of this journey is a potential chapter in someone else's story, he observed, as he made detailed notes about terrain and resources. The family from Ohio who will someday farm that valley, the merchant who will build a trading post at that river crossing, the town that will grow up around that natural spring. I'm not just traveling through empty wilderness anymore. I'm moving through America's future, seeing the country as it will be rather than as it is. St. Louis was a profound shock after 4 years of mountain solitude, an assault on senses that had grown accustomed to the subtle sounds and scents of the wilderness. The noise was overwhelming. Horses and wagons clattering over cobblestones, merchants hawking their wares, steamboat whistles echoing from the river, the constant hum of human activity that never seemed to stop. The smells were equally intense: coal smoke and cooking food, unwashed bodies and animal waste, the 1,000 different odours of a city where too many people lived too close together. But there were also comforts he'd forgotten existed, luxuries that seemed almost miraculous after years of subsistence living. Hot baths in real bathtubs with soap that produced actual lather, soft beds with clean sheets and pillows that didn't need to be fashioned from pine boughs, fresh bread from bakeries, butter that didn't have to be churned by hand, coffee that hadn't been boiled and reboiled until it was more tannin than bean, and perhaps most importantly, the company of women, conversations with females who smelled of soap and civilized things instead of wood smoke and buckskin. He spent his first week simply readjusting to urban life, staying in a boarding house and trying to make sense of how much the world had changed during his absence. The city had grown dramatically, fueled by the westward movement of settlers and the profits of various frontier enterprises. New buildings were going up everywhere, streets were being paved with brick and stone, and there was an energy of expansion and optimism that was both exciting and overwhelming. But there were also signs of the economic changes that were ending the Mountain Man era and ushering in new forms of Western development. His first stop was the offices of the American Fur Company, where he found chaos and uncertainty as managers struggled to adapt to collapsing markets and changing consumer preferences. Beaver prices had collapsed completely, and the company was liquidating its Western operations while searching for new opportunities in a rapidly changing economy. "The party's over," explained William Ashley, one of the company's founders, as they discussed the dramatic changes that had occurred during Jeremiah's years in the mountains. Fashion killed the beaver trade as sure as if they'd poisoned every stream in the Rockies. But there's still money to be made from what we learned out there. Maps, guides, information about routes and resources. That's the new currency of Western development. Ashley offered him a position with a company that was organizing wagon trains to Oregon and California, utilizing the geographical knowledge and survival skills of former mountain men to guide settlers safely across the continent. The pay was excellent, and the work would utilize all his wilderness expertise while providing steady employment and the opportunity to help shape America's westward expansion. But before committing to anything permanent, Jeremiah wanted to explore the publishing possibility that Sarah Mitchell's father had suggested during their brief encounter at his cabin. He took his journals and maps to several newspaper offices and publishing houses, hoping to find someone interested in first-hand accounts of mountain life and wilderness survival. The response exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Editors were fascinated by his detailed descriptions of frontier living, his encounters with Indians and wildlife, and his insights into the geography and resources of the Western Territories. One publisher offered him a substantial advance for a book about his mountain experiences, money that would provide financial security while he worked on other projects. Folks back east are hungry for information about the frontier, the publisher explained as they negotiated the terms of a contract that would change Jeremiah's life. But most of what they get is either complete fantasy written by people who've never been west of the Mississippi, or dry government reports that nobody can understand. Your writing has the authenticity they crave, plus the storytelling ability to hold their interest from beginning to end. Suddenly, Jeremiah found himself with multiple opportunities that he could pursue individually or combine in creative ways. He could guide wagon trains during the traveling season, work for the government as a cartographer and scout during winter months, and write about his experiences whenever time allowed. The combination would provide financial security while keeping him connected to the wilderness he loved and the changing frontier he wanted to help shape. "I thought leaving the mountains meant leaving that life behind," he wrote to a fellow trapper who'd asked about his plans. "But I'm discovering that everything I learned out there has value in this new world that's coming. The frontier isn't disappearing, it's just changing shape, and men with wilderness experience are needed now more than ever." His first assignment came from Captain Fremont, who was organizing another expedition to map the route to California and needed experienced guides who could keep a large party alive and moving through potentially hostile territory. The pay was excellent, and the work would take him back into the wilderness he missed while serving the larger purpose of national development and westward expansion. As he prepared for this new phase of his life, gathering equipment and supplies for another journey into the unknown, Jeremiah reflected on the transformation he'd undergone during his years in the mountains. 4 years of solitary living had changed him from a young man seeking adventure into someone who understood both the possibilities and responsibilities of frontier life. He'd learned to survive in the harshest conditions, but he'd also learned the value of human cooperation and the importance of sharing knowledge with those who needed it. "The mountain man era is ending," he concluded in a letter to his family back in Missouri, "but the frontier spirit it represented will live on in different forms. We opened the trails that others will follow. We proved that Americans can thrive anywhere on this continent, no matter how harsh the conditions. And we learned lessons about self-reliance and mutual aid that this growing nation will need as it spreads from sea to shining sea." The cabin he'd built with his own hands would stand empty through the coming winter, but it would endure as a testament to human ingenuity and determination. Other travelers would find shelter there, other men would study its construction and learn from his techniques. In a small way, it would continue to serve the cause of westward expansion, long after its builder had moved on to other challenges and opportunities. And in the broader sweep of American history, Jeremiah Winters and men like him had played a crucial role in the nation's development that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. They had explored unknown territories, established relationships with native tribes, and demonstrated that the vast wilderness could be crossed and settled by people with sufficient skill and determination. Their legacy would live on in the trails they blazed, the maps they drew, the knowledge they shared, and the stories they told around countless campfires. The age of the mountain man was ending, but the age of American expansion was just beginning. And the lessons learned in remote cabins and around solitary fires would help guide that expansion for generations to come, ensuring that the spirit of self-reliance and mutual aid that had characterized the frontier would continue to shape the American character long after the last wilderness had been mapped and settled. Years later, when Jeremiah had become a successful author and guide, when his books about frontier life were being read in parlors from Boston to San Francisco, he would return to that valley one final time. The cabin still stood, weathered but solid, a monument to the determination and skill of men who had refused to accept limitations imposed by geography or climate. Standing in the doorway of his old home, surrounded by the mountains that had shaped his character and defined his destiny, he understood that he had been part of something larger than individual adventure. He had been a participant in the great American experiment, the ongoing effort to create a society that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility, that honoured both the wilderness and the civilization that was slowly but inevitably replacing it. "We were the bridge," he would write in his memoirs, published to great acclaim in 1855, "between the world of the Indian and the world of the settler, between the age of wilderness and the age of development. We showed that Americans could adapt to any environment, survive any challenge, and create new forms of community even in the loneliest places on earth." In the end, Jeremiah Winter's cabin was more than just a building constructed from logs and determination. It was proof that the human spirit, when tested by the ultimate challenges, will always find a way to create light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, and hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And that perhaps is the greatest lesson the mountain men left behind, that no matter how harsh the wilderness, no matter how alone we might feel, we all have the capacity to build something that will shelter us through the storms of life. The story of the mountain men is ultimately the story of America itself, a tale of individuals who dared to venture into the unknown, who faced impossible challenges with courage and ingenuity, and who proved that with enough determination and mutual aid, human beings can not only survive but thrive in any environment. Their legacy lives on in everyone who faces adversity with determination, who builds something lasting from raw materials and raw will, and who understands that the greatest victories often come not from conquering nature, but from learning to work with it. As the 19th century progressed and the frontier officially closed, as railroads crossed the continent and telegraph lines connected distant cities, the lessons of the mountain men became more relevant, not less. In an increasingly complex and interconnected world, the virtues they embodied, self-reliance, resourcefulness, the ability to adapt and overcome, remained essential for both individual success and collective survival. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, a small log cabin still stands as a reminder of what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat, when they build their dreams one careful stroke of the axe at a time, and when they understand that the most important shelter is not just the roof over their heads, but the knowledge and determination they carry in their hearts. The weeks that followed the completion of the cabin brought a rhythm to Jeremiah's life that he hadn't experienced since leaving civilization. Each morning, he would wake to the sound of wind through the pines and the crackle of his fire. The cabin had transformed from a desperate necessity into a true home, complete with sleeping platforms, storage areas, and even a small table fashioned from a split log. Winter settled over the mountains with the inexorable weight of an avalanche, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and deadly, a white wonderland that could kill an unprepared man in a matter of hours. Snow piled higher than a man's head around the cabin, creating a white fortress that insulated and protected while simultaneously isolating him from the outside world for months at a time. Inside his snug sanctuary, Jeremiah maintained a careful routine that kept both body and mind occupied during the long, dark months when the sun seemed like a distant memory, and the outside world became little more than a theoretical concept. Routine is what keeps a man sane, he wrote in his journal one evening as wind howled outside like the voices of all the men who died unprepared in these mountains. Without it, the isolation starts eating at your mind like acid, and before you know it, you're talking to the furniture and arguing with shadows. I've seen it happen to good men, and it's not a fate I intend to share. The routine he'd developed was as precise as clockwork and just as essential to his survival. He would rise before dawn when the cabin was at its coldest and the fire had burned down to barely glowing embers. The first task was always tending the fire, the lifeline that meant the difference between warmth and death. He'd learned to bank it properly before sleep, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night, and in the morning he would carefully feed small pieces of kindling until the flames roared back to life. Then came the morning check of his snares and deadfalls, a dangerous journey through snow that might be knee-deep or might be soft enough to swallow a man whole. He'd developed a network of traps within a mile of the cabin, each one carefully positioned to take advantage of game trails and feeding areas. The work required snowshoes that he'd crafted himself from bent willow and rawhide, following techniques learned from native tribes who'd perfected the art over countless generations. The afternoons were spent in what he called productive maintenance, repairing gear that the harsh conditions constantly damaged, making new tools and equipment from available materials, and preparing for the next day's challenges. He carved spoons and bowls from pine knots, fashioned needles from porcupine quills, and constantly mended his clothing with sinew and patches cut from old garments. Nothing could be wasted in a world where the nearest store was 1,000 miles away and might as well have been on the moon. But perhaps most importantly, he crafted items for trade and future use. Snowshoes for other trappers, carved handles for knives and axes, decorated leather goods that would bring good prices at the next rendezvous. These long winter hours of careful work were an investment in his future, a way of banking labour during the idle months that would pay dividends when the trading season arrived. Evenings belonged to his journal, where he recorded not just the practical details of survival, what he'd eaten, how much firewood he'd used, what the weather had been like, but his thoughts and observations about life in the wilderness. These entries became increasingly philosophical as the isolation deepened, exploring questions about human nature, the relationship between civilization and wilderness, and the meaning of freedom in its purest form. One entry, dated December 15th, 1834, read, "Snowed 4 feet in 3 days, a white blanket that covers everything and changes the shape of the world I thought I knew. Haven't seen another human soul in 6 weeks, and I actually talked to a pine marten this morning for near an hour before I realized what I was doing. The silence out here has weight to it, like a living thing pressing down on everything, changing the way sound travels and the way thoughts form in a man's head. The isolation was perhaps the greatest challenge of mountain living, a psychological test that was in some ways more difficult than the physical hardships of cold and hunger. Modern people, accustomed to constant connection and stimulation, could never comprehend the profound solitude these men endured during the winter months. Days would pass without hearing anything but wind through the pines, the crack of settling timber expanding and contracting in the cold, and the occasional call of a distant wolf pack hunting through the frozen forest. The loneliness was the killer, one surviving mountain man would later tell an interviewer in 1890. His voice still carrying the echoes of those long-ago winters. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the bears or the Indians. It was the endless quiet that drove men mad, the way the silence could get inside your head and start eating away at your reason. I seen trappers who'd start conversations with their pack animals, then their tools, then the walls of their cabins. Some would talk to imaginary visitors for hours at a time. Some never came back from that edge, and you'd find them in the spring dead in their cabins with journals full of conversations with people who were never there. But Jeremiah had learned coping strategies during his years in the wilderness, techniques for maintaining his mental health that were as important as his physical survival skills. He would read aloud from the few books he carried, a well-worn Bible that had belonged to his father, a collection of Shakespeare's plays that he'd bought in St. Louis, and a practical guide to medicinal plants that had saved his life more than once. The sound of his own voice reading familiar passages helped maintain the connection to human language and thought, preventing the kind of mental deterioration that could be as deadly as any physical threat. He also practiced what he called memory journeys, elaborate mental exercises where he would revisit every detail of places and people from his past. He would spend hours reconstructing his childhood home in Missouri, walking through each room in his mind, remembering the feel of his mother's quilts and the pattern of morning light through the kitchen window, the smell of his father's pipe tobacco, and the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. These exercises kept his memory sharp and provided a form of entertainment that cost nothing but time. Memory is all that separates us from the animals, he wrote during one particularly philosophical evening. A bear lives in the present moment, responding to immediate needs and instincts. A man carries his entire history with him, every lesson learned and every love lost. And in the darkest times that history is what lights the way forward and reminds him why survival matters. Christmas came and went unmarked except for an extra portion of venison and a carefully rationed tot of whiskey he'd been saving for just such an occasion. He spent the day reading the nativity story aloud to the empty cabin, thinking about the irony of celebrating the birth of civilization's savior in the heart of the wilderness, thousands of miles from any church or congregation. But there was something fitting about it too, the idea that the most important truths could be found in the humblest places, that wisdom and strength often came from simplicity rather than complexity. January brought the deepest cold he'd ever experienced, a month-long siege of weather so severe that it seemed to test the very limits of what the human body could endure. For a week, the temperature never rose above 30 degrees below zero, and at night it dropped to levels that made the air itself seem brittle and dangerous. His breath would freeze instantly upon hitting the air, falling to the ground with a delicate tinkling sound like broken glass. Stepping outside, even briefly, required careful preparation, multiple layers of clothing, face protection to prevent frostbite, and the constant awareness that exposed skin could freeze solid in a matter of minutes. During these extreme cold snaps, he rarely left the cabin except to gather firewood from the carefully arranged pile he'd stacked against the south wall, close enough to reach, but far enough from the structure to prevent fire hazard. The fireplace became the center of his universe during these periods, a hungry beast that demanded constant feeding but provided the warmth that meant the difference between life and death. He learned to read the fire like a book, understanding from the color and movement of the flames exactly how much heat it was producing, how long the current load of wood would last, when to add fuel for maximum efficiency. The science of fire management became an art form during the worst weather, crucial for survival when every piece of wood had to be gathered and carried by hand, and when a fire going out could mean death before morning. He learned to bank the coals properly for overnight burns, to create drafts that would maximize heat output while minimizing fuel consumption, to identify which types of wood burned longest, and which provided the most immediate heat when quick warming was essential. Understanding wood became almost as important as understanding the weather patterns that governed mountain life. Pine burned fast and hot, perfect for quickly warming a cold cabin but requiring constant attention and feeding. Oak, when he could find it at this altitude, burned slow and steady with excellent coals for overnight banking. Birch bark made the best kindling, catching fire almost instantly even when damp, while aspen and cottonwood were poor choices that burned too fast and produced too little heat for the effort required to gather them. He developed elaborate systems for wood storage and preparation that would have seemed obsessive to an outside observer, but made perfect sense in a world where poor planning could result in death. Different types of wood were stacked separately according to their burning characteristics. Quick-burning material near the fireplace for rapid heating, long-burning logs stored further back for overnight use, and a special reserve of the finest dry wood kept in the cabin itself for emergency use during the worst storms, when venturing outside became impossible. The process of wood gathering itself became a complex calculation involving weather forecasting, energy expenditure, and risk assessment. Too far from the cabin and he might be caught in a sudden storm. Too little gathered and he might run short during a prolonged cold snap. Too much energy expended in gathering, and he might exhaust himself when calories were precious and food was limited. Every decision had cascading consequences that could affect his survival weeks or months later. A mountain man's relationship with fire, observed a historian who studied frontier survival techniques, was more intimate than most marriages. He understood its moods, its needs, its capabilities. His life literally depended on that understanding, and that kind of dependence creates a knowledge that goes beyond the intellectual to something almost instinctual. But fire management was only one aspect of winter survival that required constant attention and expertise. Water, seemingly abundant in a landscape covered with snow, presented its own complex challenges during the extreme cold periods. Snow had to be melted for drinking water, a process that consumed valuable fuel and time while producing surprisingly little liquid. It took a large pot of snow to yield even a modest amount of water, and the melting process had to be carefully managed to avoid scalding the metal containers that could crack from rapid temperature changes. Ice formation inside the cabin became a constant battle during the coldest periods, as moisture from breathing, cooking, and melting snow would condense on the walls and freeze, creating a growing coating of ice that had to be regularly chipped away to prevent it from becoming thick enough to affect the cabin's insulation properties. His breath would hang in visible clouds even inside the supposedly warm cabin, and he learned to position himself carefully relative to the fire to avoid creating drafts that would carry precious heat up the chimney and out into the frozen night. Food preservation and preparation also required specialized knowledge that went far beyond simple cooking. Meat had to be kept frozen outside but brought in regularly to prevent it from becoming so hard that it couldn't be cut or cooked. Stored food had to be protected from scavenging animals while remaining accessible during storms when going outside was dangerous. Cooking itself became an elaborate dance of fuel conservation and nutrition maximization, with every calorie precious and every piece of wood carefully rationed. He learned to create elaborate stews that would cook slowly all day, maximizing the heat output from his cooking fire, while producing meals that would provide sustained energy for the demanding work of winter survival. Bone broths became a staple, extracting every possible nutrient from the animals he'd harvested, while providing warming liquid that helped combat the dehydrating effects of dry mountain air and wood smoke. The psychological techniques he'd developed for maintaining mental health proved equally complex and essential for survival. Beyond reading aloud and memory journeys, He created elaborate mental exercises that served multiple purposes, keeping his mind sharp, providing entertainment during the endless dark hours, and maintaining the human connections that isolation threatened to erode. "The cold at 40 below is a living enemy," he noted in his most detailed journal entry about extreme weather survival. "It seeks out every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Breathe too deeply and it burns your lungs. Touch metal with bare skin, and it tears away flesh when you pull free. This is cold that kills, and it's patient as death itself. But the real enemy isn't the cold. It's the way the cold makes you think differently, makes you careless, makes you give up the routines and habits that keep you alive. The cold wants you to make mistakes, and out here, mistakes are fatal." During these extreme cold snaps, he rarely left the cabin except to gather firewood from the pile he'd stacked against the south wall. The fireplace became the center of his universe, a hungry beast that demanded constant feeding, but provided the warmth that meant the difference between life and death. He learned to read the fire like a book, understanding from the color and movement of the flames exactly how much heat it was producing, how long the current load of wood would last, when to add fuel for maximum efficiency. Fire management became an art form, crucial for survival when every piece of wood had to be gathered and carried by hand. "A mountain man's relationship with fire," observed a historian who studied frontier survival techniques, "was more intimate than most marriages. He understood its moods, its needs, its capabilities. His life literally depended on that understanding." February brought a brief warm spell that fooled him into thinking winter might be loosening its grip. One of those treacherous periods when mountain weather played tricks on even experienced men. The temperature rose above freezing for 3 days, melting snow and creating a false sense of spring that could lure the unwary into making fatal mistakes. Water dripped from the cabin's eaves like music, and patches of bare ground appeared on south-facing slopes, revealing the brown earth beneath like promises of renewal. But then the cold returned with vengeance, harder than before, catching him unprepared during what should have been a routine check of his trap lines. He'd been following a familiar game trail about 2 miles from the cabin, moving through terrain he thought he knew like the back of his hand, when the temperature plummeted with the suddenness that marked true mountain weather. What had been a mild afternoon with temperatures hovering around the melting point suddenly became a life-threatening emergency, as Arctic air poured down from the peaks like an invisible avalanche. The wind picked up with frightening speed, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and reducing visibility to mere feet in a matter of minutes. "Got turned around in the whiteout," he would later write in his journal, the words seeming inadequate to capture the terror of the experience. "Couldn't see my own feet, let alone find my way back to the cabin. The whole world just disappeared, like somebody had wrapped me in a white sheet and spun me around until I didn't know up from down. This is how men die out here, not dramatically fighting bears or Indians, but lost and confused, walking in circles until they freeze to death just yards from safety. For 4 hours that felt like 4 days. He wandered through the storm, following what he hoped were his own tracks back toward shelter, but finding himself increasingly disoriented as the wind filled in his footprints and obliterated every familiar landmark. His hands and feet went numb despite his carefully crafted beaver skin mittens and moccasins, the cold creeping through even the best insulation when exposed to such extreme conditions. Ice formed in his beard and eyebrows, weighing down his face and making it increasingly difficult to see through eyes that were beginning to freeze shut. Panic began to creep in as darkness approached, and he still had no sign of the cabin, no indication that he was moving in the right direction rather than wandering deeper into the wilderness. This was the kind of situation that had killed better men than him, experienced trappers who'd made one small mistake and paid for it with their lives. The mountains were littered with the bones of men who'd been caught in sudden storms, who'd lost their way in weather that changed faster than human reflexes could adapt. Fear is a luxury you can't afford in the wilderness, he reminded himself, forcing his mind to work methodically through the problem, rather than surrendering to the panic that wanted to send him running blindly through the snow. Panic kills faster than cold, and cold kills pretty damn fast. Think, Jeremiah, what would Bridger do? What would any of the old-timers do in this situation? He stopped moving and listened with every fibre of his being, trying to identify any landmark sound that might orient him in the howling chaos of the storm. Nothing at first but wind and his own laboured breathing, the sound of his heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo in his ears. Then faintly, almost lost in the wind, he heard it, the sound of his own axe, still buried in the chopping stump where he'd left it that morning. The wind was carrying the metallic ring as it swayed against the wood, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination, but so familiar that his ear picked it out of the storm's symphony. Following that sound like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, he found his way back to the cabin just as full darkness fell and the storm reached its peak intensity. His hands were so numb he could barely work the latch, fingers like frozen sticks that refused to bend properly. Once inside, it took an hour by the fire before feeling returned to his extremities, accompanied by the excruciating pain that marked the return of circulation to nearly frost-bitten flesh. "Came closer to dying today than I have in 3 years," he wrote that night, his hand still shaking slightly as he held the pencil. Not from bears or Indians or avalanches, but from simple disorientation in a storm. Got cocky, thought I knew this country well enough to travel without proper preparation. The mountains are always teaching lessons, and the price of failing the test is your life. Won't make that mistake again. The experience served as a harsh reminder of how quickly the mountains could turn deadly, even for experienced men who thought they understood the rules of wilderness survival. Weather in the high country could change with frightening speed, transforming familiar terrain into alien landscapes where a single wrong step could lead to disaster. It was a lesson that many trappers learned too late, if they lived to learn it at all. March brought the first real hints that winter's grip might finally be loosening, though Jeremiah had learned to be suspicious of such signs after his February near disaster. The snow developed a crust during the cold nights that could support his weight on snowshoes during the morning hours, allowing him to travel farther from the cabin to check trap lines and hunt for fresh meat. The days grew noticeably longer, with sunrise coming earlier and sunset arriving later each day, a gradual but welcome change that lifted his spirits after months of abbreviated daylight. Occasionally he could hear the musical drip of melting snow from the cabin's eaves, a sound that seemed to promise warmer days ahead. But he'd learned not to trust such promises too readily. Spring in the mountains was perhaps the most treacherous season of all, full of false hopes and deadly surprises that could kill the unprepared or the overconfident. Warm days would be followed by killing frosts that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Snow would melt during the day, creating streams and puddles, then freeze at night into ice slicks that could send a man tumbling down a mountainside. Most dangerous of all were the streams that had been frozen solid all winter, but would suddenly become raging torrents, as snowmelt from the high peaks swelled their banks beyond all recognition. crossings that had been safe for months could become death traps overnight, with currents strong enough to sweep away a man and his horse without warning. "Spring is the cruelest season in high country," he observed in his journal, after watching a usually placid creek become a chocolate-brown torrent in the space of a few hours. "It whispers promises of warmth and green growing things, then turns around and tries to kill you with an avalanche or flood. A wise man doesn't trust spring until he's seen bare ground for a full week, and even then keeps one eye on the sky." His trap lines had been moderately successful through the winter, providing both trading material and essential protein during the lean months. Beaver pelts, fox furs, and the occasional marten had accumulated in his storage cache, carefully preserved against moisture and pests. But trapping in winter was dangerous work that required daily travel through unpredictable terrain to check and reset snares, exposing him to all the hazards that mountain weather could produce. The work was also becoming increasingly difficult as beaver populations declined due to intensive trapping pressure throughout the region. What had once been productive streams now yielded fewer and fewer pelts, forcing trappers to range farther afield and take greater risks for diminishing returns. It was another sign that the era of easy profits from the fur trade was coming to an end, though Jeremiah was still reluctant to fully accept that reality. One morning in late March, he discovered that his most productive beaver dam had been visited by something large during the night, something that had torn apart his carefully set traps and scattered them across the creek bank like toys. Massive paw prints in the mud told the story clearly enough. A grizzly bear, newly awakened from its winter hibernation and hungry enough to investigate any potential food source, even if it meant destroying valuable equipment in the process. Bears coming out of hibernation are about the most dangerous thing you can encounter in these mountains, he wrote, after examining the destruction with a mixture of anger and apprehension. They're starving, disoriented, and aggressive as hell. Got nothing to lose and everything to gain by taking whatever they can find. A wise trapper gives them plenty of room and doesn't argue over a few beaver pelts. Not worth getting mauled or killed over. He abandoned that trapline for 2 weeks, giving the bear time to move on to other hunting grounds and find easier sources of food. It was a significant loss of potential income, representing dozens of hours of work and several valuable traps that would have to be replaced. But staying alive was more important than maximizing his catch, and this kind of pragmatic decision-making was what separated successful mountain men from those who became cautionary tales told around trading post fires. The encounter also served as a reminder that he shared these mountains with creatures far more powerful and dangerous than himself, predators that viewed him not as the apex being he sometimes felt like, but as just another potential meal to be evaluated and possibly consumed. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolf packs, all of them possessed advantages in strength, speed, or numbers that could overwhelm even the most experienced trapper if he made the wrong choice at the wrong moment. April brought the real beginning of spring, with patches of bare ground appearing on south-facing slopes and the first tentative green shoots pushing through the snow. The sound of running water grew louder each day as winter's ice gave way to spring's floods. It was during this season of renewal that Jeremiah encountered his most dangerous challenge yet. He was checking a beaver dam about 3 miles from the cabin when he heard voices, human voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Keeping low, he crept through the willows until he could see the speakers, 5 Blackfoot warriors, heavily armed and clearly on a raiding expedition. They were examining his trap sets, and from their animated discussion, they weren't pleased to find evidence of white trappers in what they considered their territory. Blackfoot don't negotiate, he'd been warned by other trappers. They shoot first and take scalps later. Best thing you can do if you see them is get gone and hope they don't see you. But getting gone wasn't going to be easy. The warriors were between him and the Sabin, and they showed no signs of moving on quickly. One of them was following his snowshoe tracks, clearly intending to trace them back to their source. Jeremiah had two choices: try to circle around them and race back to the cabin, or find a defensive position and hope they would lose interest and move on. Neither option was particularly appealing, but sitting still while they tracked him to his home was not an option at all. He chose a middle course, working his way upstream along the creek bed, using the sound of running water to mask his movement. If he could get far enough ahead of them, he might be able to reach the cabin and prepare for a siege. The next 2 hours were the longest of his life. Moving silently through the brush while carrying his rifle and trap sack, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit, fighting the urge to panic and run. Every snapped twig or disturbed stone might give away his position. When he finally reached the cabin, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely load his rifle. He barricaded the door with his heaviest furniture and positioned himself at the single window where he could cover the approaches. Then he waited, finger on the trigger, for whatever was coming. "This is what real fear feels like," he wrote later. Not the quick jolt you get from a rattlesnake or a cliff edge, but the slow, grinding terror of knowing that death might be walking toward you and there's nothing you can do but wait and see. Hours passed with no sign of the warriors. As darkness fell, he began to hope they had lost his trail, or decided the pursuit wasn't worth the effort. But he didn't dare leave the cabin to check, and he spent the night dozing fitfully with his rifle across his knees. Dawn revealed no signs of disturbance around the cabin, no tracks, no evidence that anyone had approached during the night. But Jeremiah wasn't taking any chances. He spent the day watching from the window, and it wasn't until afternoon that he finally saw them. The 5 warriors, moving through the trees about a quarter-mile away, heading east toward the main valley. They had given up the pursuit, or perhaps they had never been following him at all. Maybe they had simply been passing through, and his hiding place had been sufficient to avoid detection. Either way, he had survived another potentially fatal encounter. Luck plays a bigger role in survival than most men want to admit, he reflected. You can be as skilled and careful as humanly possible, but sometimes it comes down to pure chance. Today the luck was with me. Tomorrow it might not be. The incident reminded him of his fundamental vulnerability. All his skills, all his preparations, all his careful planning could be undone by a single unlucky encounter. The wilderness was vast, but it wasn't empty, and not all of its inhabitants were friendly to lone trappers. May brought an explosion of life to the mountains. Snow melted rapidly, exposing meadows full of wildflowers. Trees leafed out almost overnight, transforming the stark winter landscape into something lush and green. Wildlife emerged from winter shelters, and the forest filled with the sounds of mating calls and territorial disputes. It was also the season when other trappers began to move through the area, heading to summer rendezvous or new trapping grounds. Jeremiah's solitude was broken by occasional visitors, some welcome, others less so. The first to arrive was a grizzled old-timer named Moses Carson, brother of the famous Kit Carson. Moses was leading a pack train of furs toward the settlements, and he stopped to rest and trade news. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of civilization in 8 months," Moses said as they shared coffee around Jeremiah's fire. "You get any news from the outside world?" "Nothing since last fall," Jeremiah replied. "Far as I know, Andrew Jackson's still president and the world's still turning. They traded information about trail conditions, Indian activity, and the price of beaver pelts at various trading posts. This exchange of intelligence was crucial for survival in the wilderness, where accurate information could mean the difference between life and death. "Beaver market's going soft," Moses warned. "Them silk hats are getting popular back east. Might want to think about other lines of work." It was news that would prove prophetic. The era of the beaver trapper was already ending, though few recognized it at the time. Fashion changes in distant cities would ultimately drive the mountain men from their wilderness homes, ending a way of life that had lasted barely a generation. Other visitors followed throughout the summer. A young trapper named Billy Sublette stopped by, seeking advice about winter preparations. A party of missionaries passed through, bound for Oregon territory, shocked by the primitive conditions but grateful for Jeremiah's guidance about mountain routes. Each visitor brought news, trade opportunities, and human contact that helped break the isolation of wilderness living. But they also brought reminders of the world beyond the mountains, the civilization that these men had left behind in search of freedom and adventure. "Sometimes I wonder what I'm doing out here," Jeremiah wrote, after a particularly poignant conversation with a missionary's wife, who spoke longingly of gardens and churches and schools. "Living like a savage while the world moves on without me. But then I step outside and see the mountains in the morning light, and I remember why I came." Summer was the busy season for mountain men. Traps had to be repaired and reset. Camps had to be moved to follow game migrations, and preparations had to be made for the next winter. There was also the annual rendezvous, a gathering of trappers, traders, and Indians, where a year's worth of furs would be traded for supplies and news. Jeremiah decided to attend the 1835 rendezvous at Green River, his first contact with the larger mountain man community in over a year. The journey took 2 weeks, following ancient Indian trails through some of the most spectacular country on the continent. The rendezvous was a revelation. Hundreds of men gathered in a vast meadow, their camps spread along the river like a temporary city. There were Mexicans from Santa Fe, French voyageurs from Canada, American trappers from every state, and Indians from dozens of tribes. The air was filled with smoke from countless fires and the sound of trading in a dozen languages. "It's like Babylon," Jeremiah marveled in his journal. "Every type of man you can imagine, all gathered for the same purpose, to trade fur for goods and stories for whiskey." The trading was intense and competitive. Beaver pelts were graded and priced, with the best bringing enough to support a man for months. But the prices were lower than previous years, confirming Moses Carson's warning about the declining market. "Beaver's finished," confirmed William Ashley, one of the major fur company executives. "Silk hats are the fashion now. You boys better start thinking about other opportunities." Some men refused to believe it, insisting that beaver would come back into fashion. Others began making plans to leave the mountains, to return to civilization, or seek new opportunities in Oregon or California. The writing was on the wall, though few wanted to read it. For Jeremiah, the rendezvous was both exhilarating and sobering. The human contact was welcome after months of solitude. But the news about the fur market was troubling. He had built his entire life around trapping, and the thought of starting over was daunting. Change is the only constant in this world, he reflected. A man who can't adapt dies, whether he's in the wilderness or the city. The question is what to do next. He spent 2 weeks at the rendezvous, trading his furs, buying supplies, and gathering information about opportunities beyond trapping. Some men were talking about guiding wagon trains to Oregon. Others planned to hunt buffalo for the hide trade. A few spoke of striking out for California and the rumored gold discoveries there. When it came time to leave, Jeremiah faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could return to his cabin for another winter, continuing to trap even as the market declined. He could join one of the groups heading west to new opportunities. Or he could return to civilization and try to rebuild his life in the world he had left behind. "Every man has to choose his own path," he wrote on his last night at the rendezvous. "The mountains have given me everything I came looking for: freedom, adventure, and the knowledge that I can survive anything. But maybe it's time to see what else the world has to offer." In the morning, he would make his choice. But for now, he sat by his fire listening to the sounds of the camp around him, men laughing, singing, arguing, and planning their futures. It was the sound of a way of life in transition, of an era ending and a new one beginning. The mountain men had opened the west, but their time was passing. The trails they blazed would soon carry wagon trains full of settlers. The valleys where they trapped would become farms and towns. The freedom they had found in the wilderness would give way to the order and progress of civilization, but their legacy would endure. In the cabins they built, the trails they marked, and the stories they told around countless campfires, the spirit of the mountain men would live on. They had proved that with courage, skill, and determination, human beings could thrive in the harshest environments on Earth. And perhaps most importantly, they had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest adventures come not from conquering nature, but from learning to live within it, to find shelter and warmth and meaning, even in the coldest, most unforgiving places on Earth. The decision came to him as he watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold on his final morning at the rendezvous. Jeremiah would return to his cabin for one more winter, but it would be his last as a full-time trapper. He had decided to use the coming months to prepare for a new chapter in his life. "A man's got to know when one trail ends and another begins," he told Moses Carson as they shared a final cup of coffee. "The mountains taught me everything I needed to know about survival. Now it's time to see what I can do with that knowledge." The journey back to his cabin was different from any he'd taken before. Instead of simply following familiar trails, he studied the landscape with new eyes, mapping routes that wagon trains might follow, identifying places where settlements might someday flourish. He was beginning to see the wilderness not just as a place to extract resources, but as a territory waiting to be developed. "Every valley I pass through, I imagine what it might look like with farms and towns," he wrote in his journal. "The trapper sees game trails and beaver dams. The settler sees hayfields and mill sites. I'm starting to see both, and it changes everything." When he reached his cabin in late August, it felt both like coming home and saying goodbye. The structure was exactly as he'd left it, solid and weatherproof, but somehow it seemed smaller than he remembered. A year of growth and change had altered his perspective on what constituted sufficient shelter. He spent the fall months in intense preparation, but not just for winter survival. He was also documenting everything he'd learned during his years in the mountains, creating a comprehensive guide that might help future settlers and travelers. "Knowledge dies with the man who possesses it unless he takes the trouble to write it down," he reflected. "I've seen too many good men take their skills to the grave. Maybe I can prevent some of that waste." His journal entries became increasingly detailed and systematic. He recorded not just what happened each day, but why he made particular decisions, what alternatives he considered, and what he would do differently in similar circumstances. It was the beginning of what would eventually become one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of mountain life. The winter of 1835-1836 was harsh even by mountain standards. Snow fell early and deep, and the temperature dropped to levels that challenged even Jeremiah's hard-won survival skills. But his cabin held strong, and his preparations proved adequate for the extended siege of cold and snow. During the long winter nights, he worked on his writing by firelight, creating maps and diagrams to accompany his written descriptions. He sketched the construction details of his cabin, illustrated the best knots for various purposes, and drew the tracks of every animal he'd encountered in the mountains. "This will be my legacy," he wrote. "Not the beaver I trapped or the miles I travelled, but the knowledge I can pass on to those who come after." The isolation that winter was profound, but it no longer felt oppressive. He had a purpose beyond mere survival, a project that engaged his mind and gave meaning to the solitude. The work helped him process his experiences and prepare for the transition ahead. Spring arrived late but dramatic, with massive snowmelts that turned every creek into a raging torrent. The familiar landscape was transformed once again, reminding him of nature's constant cycle of death and renewal. It seemed appropriate that his own life was following a similar pattern. By May, other trappers were moving through the area again, and their news confirmed what he'd suspected. The beaver trade was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Several major fur companies were closing operations, and prices for pelts had dropped to barely profitable levels. "It's over," announced a trader named Jim Bridger who stopped by in early June. "The gentlemen in New York and London have decided they prefer silk to beaver. We can trap until our backs break, but there's no money in it anymore." But Bridger brought other news as well, opportunities for men with mountain experience. Governments organizing expeditions to map the territory for future settlement. Army needs guides who know the country, and there's talk of a railroad to the Pacific. Somebody's going to have to survey the routes. These possibilities intrigued Jeremiah. His years in the wilderness had given him skills that were still valuable, even if the specific occupation of trapping was ending. He could read terrain, navigate by natural landmarks, and survive in conditions that would kill inexperienced men. These abilities would be crucial as America expanded westward. The summer of 1836 brought a steady stream of visitors to his remote valley. Word had spread about his reputation as a skilled mountain man and generous host, and travelers sought him out for advice and assistance. He helped lost hunters find their way, treated injured trappers with his collection of medicinal plants, and shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. "Every person who stops here teaches me something," he observed. "Even the greenest pilgrim from back east has perspectives I've never considered. Knowledge flows both ways if you're willing to listen." One of his most memorable visitors was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, traveling with her family to Oregon Territory. She was the first woman he'd seen in over 2 years, and her presence reminded him powerfully of the civilized world he'd left behind. "You live like a hermit," she observed after touring his cabin, "but you're more educated than most men I've met in cities. Why do you choose this isolation?" It was a question that forced him to examine his motivations more deeply than he'd done before. "I came here looking for freedom," he told her. "Freedom from other people's expectations, from society's rules, from everything that tried to tell me who I should be. I found that freedom, but I also found something else. The knowledge of what I'm truly capable of when everything depends on my own skills and judgment." Sarah's family stayed for 3 days, resting their animals and replenishing their supplies. Her father, a former schoolteacher, was fascinated by Jeremiah's journals and maps. "You should publish these," he urged. "There are people back east who would pay good money for this kind of first-hand information about the frontier." The idea had never occurred to Jeremiah, but it planted a seed that would eventually change his life. Perhaps his years in the wilderness could be transformed into something more than just personal experience. Maybe his knowledge could help guide the wave of settlement that was clearly coming. August brought the most significant visitor of all, Captain John Fremont of the U.S. Army's Corps of Topographical Engineers. Fremont was leading a scientific expedition to map the Western Territories, and he'd heard about Jeremiah's reputation as a reliable guide and source of geographical information. "We need men who know this country intimately," Fremont explained. "Not just the game trails and water sources, but the geology, the climate patterns, the best routes for large groups of travelers. The government is planning for the future development of this region, and we need accurate maps to make that possible." The offer was tempting: good pay, regular employment, and the chance to be part of something larger than individual survival. But it would mean leaving the mountains for extended periods, working within the structure of military organization, and giving up the complete independence he'd valued so highly. "I'll need time to think about it," Jeremiah told the captain. "This place has been my home for 4 years. Leaving it won't be easy." Fremont understood. "The offer remains open," he said, "but don't wait too long. The country is changing rapidly, and opportunities like this won't last forever." After Fremont's party moved on, Jeremiah spent long hours walking the familiar trails around his valley, trying to imagine leaving it all behind. Every landmark held memories: the creek where he'd first seen beaver sign, the ridge where he'd weathered a 3-day blizzard, the meadow where he'd encountered his first grizzly bear. "This valley made me who I am," he wrote. "Every skill I possess, every lesson I've learned, every moment of confidence I feel comes from my time here. But maybe that's exactly why I need to leave. The mountains have given me everything they can. Now it's time to see what the rest of the world needs from what I've learned." September brought the first hints of autumn, and with them a sense of urgency about making his decision. He couldn't delay much longer if he was going to leave before winter locked the high country in snow and ice. The deciding moment came during a chance encounter with a family of settlers who had become lost while attempting to reach Oregon Territory. They'd been wandering for days, running low on supplies, when they stumbled across his cabin. The father was injured, one of the children was sick, and they were clearly in desperate straits. Jeremiah spent a week nursing them back to health and guiding them to the main trail. As he watched them disappear down the valley, heading toward their new life in Oregon, he realized that this was what his future looked like: helping people navigate the transition from the settled East to the Wild West. "The age of the solitary mountain man is ending," he wrote that night, "but the age of the frontier guide is just beginning. There will be thousands of families like the Johnsons, people who need someone to show them the way through this wilderness. Maybe that's my calling now." He spent October putting his affairs in order. He cached supplies and tools that he might need if he ever returned, sealed his cabin against winter weather, and prepared for the journey back to civilization. It was a strange reversal of the process he'd gone through 4 years earlier when leaving the settlements for the wilderness. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the place itself. The valley had been his home, his sanctuary, his university, and his proving ground. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the creek held significance for him. He'd arrived as a young man seeking adventure and freedom. He was leaving as someone who understood both the possibilities and the costs of that freedom. "I came here to escape civilization," he wrote in his final journal entry from the cabin. "I'm leaving to help bring civilization to others. The irony isn't lost on me, but maybe that's how progress works. Each generation prepares the way for the next." The journey back to St. Louis took 3 weeks. following trails he'd traveled countless times but now seeing them with different eyes. Instead of looking for beaver sign and game trails, he studied the routes from the perspective of wagon trains and future development. Where were the best river crossings? Which passes would be most practical for heavily loaded wagons? Where would settlements naturally develop? Every mile of this journey is a potential chapter in someone else's story, he observed. The family from Ohio who will someday farm that valley, the merchant who will build a trading post at that river crossing, the town that will grow up around that natural spring. I'm not just traveling through empty wilderness anymore. I'm moving through America's future. St. Louis was a shock after 4 years of mountain solitude. The noise, the crowds, the smells of civilization all overwhelmed senses that had grown accustomed to the subtle sounds and scents of the wilderness. But there were also comforts he'd forgotten. Hot baths, soft beds, fresh bread, and the company of women. He spent his first week simply readjusting to urban life, staying in a boarding house and trying to make sense of how much the world had changed during his absence. The city had grown dramatically, fueled by the westward movement of settlers and the profits of the fur trade. But there were also signs of the economic changes that were ending the Mountain Man era. His first stop was the offices of the American Fur Company, where he found chaos and uncertainty. Beaver prices had collapsed completely, and the company was liquidating its western operations. Men who had been wealthy fur barons just years before were now scrambling to find new opportunities. "The party's over," explained William Ashley, one of the company's founders. "Fashion killed the beaver trade as sure as if they'd poisoned every stream in the mountains. But there's still money to be made from what we learned out there. Maps, guides, information. That's the new currency of Western development." Ashley offered him a position with a company that was organizing wagon trains to Oregon and California. The pay was good, and the work would utilize all his wilderness skills while providing steady employment. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping to find. But before committing to anything, Jeremiah wanted to explore the publishing possibility that Sarah Mitchell's father had suggested. He took his journals and maps to several newspaper offices, hoping to find someone interested in first-hand accounts of mountain life. The response exceeded his expectations. Editors were fascinated by his detailed descriptions of wilderness survival, his encounters with Indians and wildlife, and his insights into the geography of the Western Territories. One publisher offered him a substantial advance for a book about his mountain experiences. Folks back east are hungry for information about the frontier, the publisher explained. But most of what they get is either complete fantasy or dry government reports. Your writing has the authenticity they crave, plus the storytelling ability to hold their interest. Suddenly, Jeremiah found himself with multiple opportunities. He could guide wagon trains, work for the government as a cartographer and scout, or try his hand at writing about his experiences. Each option offered different advantages and challenges, but all of them would allow him to build on what he'd learned in the mountains. The decision came easier than he'd expected. Why choose just one? He could guide expeditions during the traveling season, work on maps and reports during the winter months, and write about his experiences whenever time allowed. The combination would provide financial security while keeping him connected to the wilderness he loved. "I thought leaving the mountains meant leaving that life behind," he wrote to a fellow trapper. "But I'm discovering that everything I learned out there has value in this new world that's coming. The frontier isn't disappearing, it's just changing shape." His first assignment came from Captain Framel, who was organizing another expedition to map the route to California. The pay was excellent, and the work would take him back into the wilderness he missed while serving the larger purpose of national development. As he prepared for this new phase of his life, Jeremiah reflected on the transformation he'd undergone. 4 years in the mountains had changed him from a young man seeking adventure into someone who understood both the possibilities and responsibilities of frontier life. He'd learned to survive in the harshest conditions, but he'd also learned the value of human cooperation and community. The mountain man era is ending, he concluded, but the frontier spirit it represented will live on in different forms. We opened the trails that others will follow. We proved that Americans can thrive anywhere on this continent. And we learned lessons about self-reliance and mutual aid that this growing nation will need as it spreads from sea to sea. The cabin he'd built with his own hands would stand empty through the coming winter, but it would endure. Other travelers would find shelter there, other men would study its construction and learn from his techniques. In a small way, it would continue to serve the cause of westward expansion, long after its builder had moved on to other challenges, and in the broader sweep of American history, Jeremiah Winters and men like him had played a crucial role in the nation's development. They had explored unknown territories, established relationships with native tribes, and demonstrated that the vast wilderness could be crossed and settled. Their legacy would live on in the trails they blazed, the maps they drew, and the stories they told around countless campfires. The age of the mountain man was ending, but the age of American expansion was just beginning. And the lessons learned in remote cabins and around solitary fires would help guide that expansion for generations to come. In the end, Jeremiah Winters' cabin was more than just a building. It was proof that the human spirit, when tested by the ultimate challenges, will always find a way to create light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, and hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And that perhaps is the greatest lesson the mountain men left behind, that no matter how harsh the wilderness, no matter how alone we might feel, we all have the capacity to build something that will shelter us through the storms of life.